No, thank you so much, Agisan, and thanks to Riti for this terrific invitation and this great opportunity to engage with both Japanese and European audiences on this important topic of economic security, because I think more than anything this year, 2025 has underlined the importance of economic security in several ways. And the ways I want to talk to you about today is control over what I would call the skeleton of the global economy, the skeleton of all our critical sectors and manufacturing industries, which I think are critical raw materials. So if you pull out the critical raw materials, you don't have MRI scanners, you don't have pacemakers, you don't have fighter jets that we both need for deterrence in East Asia and deterrence in Eastern Europe. You don't have drones. You don't have wind turbines, you don't have solar panels. In short, you don't have your critical sectors. You don't have an energy grid either. Without these critical raw materials, so sort of the skeleton of the global economy, and how we've seen that especially on part of Beijing, there's an effort to now deny access to these critical raw materials to not just the United States, in which it's engaged in this competition, but really most countries around the world throughout 2025. And on the other hand, what I would call the central nervous system of the global economy. And the central nervous system will be the semiconductors. So if, like the critical raw materials, you pull out the semiconductors, you also don't have MRI technologies or pacemakers or medical goods in general, or, well, defense, weapon systems, et cetera, et cetera. And crucially, within this sector, we see an explosion of Chinese market share, especially in foundational chips on the lower end that are incredibly important to all of these vital sectors. And of course, an existing very powerful market share in back-end manufacturing, so the assembly, testing, and packaging. And of course, this came to show this year with the case of Nexperia, where our minister tried to freeze the decisions of the management of the company, the Chinese ownership, to move sensitive IP and capital and other means of the company to a Chinese competitor of that company. Our minister frees that, and as a result of this, and our minister, when I say our, it's Dutch, let me be clear, I don't speak on behalf of any government or the EU, I speak on behalf of a think tank. But I'm still a Dutch national, so occasionally I'll say things like this. To freeze this ownership, which of course the Chinese retaliated with first a general export ban, and then sort of drip feeding semiconductors again to the rest of the world. And the interesting thing is the Chinese were able to do that because 70% of Nexperia's back-end manufacturing takes place in China. Front end is still by far the largest majority happening in Europe, but the back end in China. So what do foundational chips, especially back-end and critical raw materials, have in common? They are low economic value added, but strategically indispensable. So it's not something you're going to make a lot of money off, but if you don't have the product, you have an enormous problem throughout both your critical sectors, but also commercially extremely important sectors, like the automotive industry. So this is the problem set, I think, that we've been given this year. And the view from Brussels is we struggle to find a solution. We're moving in the right directions. There's important policies coming out like the Resource EU and a subsequent step in our economic security doctrines, and individual member states are taking important steps as well. Germany will publish its critical mineral strategy soon in the new year. But it's always a great pleasure to come to Japan, because Japan, like Europe, is an entity that believes in free exchange and is increasingly placing importance as well on economic security together with partners. And in Japan, of course, we see a much more advanced version, not just of economic security thinking, but also of the creation of institutions that can create practical solutions. And I'm thinking, of course, of JOGMEC here, which is a great way to combine both expertise and financial means to make critical raw material products outside of China competitive again. because that's what we're all struggling with, given the technology gaps that we have, because of a lot of the technology was either developed in China and then put under export controls, either explicitly or implicitly. And given that if we look at a case like rare earths, well, there's 2 producers in China, 2 conglomerates, state-owned, heavily state-sponsored, that can heavily influence global prices. We all know that mining companies outside of China or refining companies, they are not going to make a 20-year investment if they know that China can just flood the market again. So there needs to be geopolitically motivated government intervention. And I think with JOGMEC, you've done both, because you don't just have the expertise, and the expertise is necessary to overcome the knowledge gaps of particular machinery and particular, let's say, core knowledge that exists in China, but not anywhere outside, but you also have the financial muscle to make projects bankable again. And Europe is looking to Japan for inspiration on this, with the announcement as well within Resource EU that in addition to making 3 billion euros available for these sorts of projects, it's not just going to be that. In 2026, we'll set up our own version of JOGMEC, combining expertise, looking into stockpiling, etc. It's not just that, it's also in 2026 there will be public procurement reform. And there's now a discussion in Brussels, should we move from general requirements to buy Europe, or should it be buy Europe plus partner? And me as an analyst of economic security, what we constantly keep saying is, there's a lot of expertise in the world, you don't need to do everything alone as Europe, there's still countries we can trade with in good trust. So don't make the yard too small, because our critical raw material projects are still that. There are ideas on paper, but very few money has been allocated and there's concrete timelines. While at the same time, of course, the moment of maximum urgency is now. In Europe, we're trying to deter Russia, possibly with a lot less America, or in a worst case scenario, even without America. And this requires rearmament. And not just rearmament, it requires very rapid rearmament and a rapid expansion of our capabilities. And a rapid expansion of our capabilities, of our weapon systems, requires semiconductors, critical raw materials, and all the horizontal layers of the global economy that we all depend on. So this is what I would like to do with you today. I would like to delve into the 2 cases. Critical raw materials first, then the semiconductors. I'll give you an overview of 2 things. One of where European thinking, what is the problem? So how do we see China using the tools it has in both industries? What is current thinking on solutions in the EU? And what I think would be required to make the problem go away. And in that final part, there's a lot of room for cooperation with Japan, which there's not just a lot of room, it's essential, especially on the critical raw material part. So I'll do that for both, and I'll explain explicitly, and please keep me to this, Aki, if I forget and I don't make it Japanese enough, my presentation, the policy recommendation, tell me we need to go back to where we can cooperate. I'll run you through both of those cases, and then we can have a discussion and question and answer session on this afterwards. So if you go to our first slide, what you basically see here is a timetable. And it's a timetable of a US-China action-reaction cycle, where whenever the US either takes new semiconductor measures curtailing technology exports to China on the very high end of technologies, you see China adding new materials under export controls. So one example, we had Trump's reciprocal tariffs earlier this year, and China put rare earths, heavy rare earths, under the 4 April controls. We had an imposition of 25% tariffs against China in February, and China responded putting tungsten, indium, bismuth, tellurium, molybdenum on the list. Well, if you look at this table, there's clearly an action-reaction cycle between the US and China, but the question becomes, why does China punish us in Europe? why is material supply to us being squeezed so hard? Well, for the majority of the reaction cycle, Europe wasn't present. The only time that we were present is really, let's say, mid-2023, when the Dutch government and the Japanese government and the US decided to limit not just ASML's EUV systems, the most modern semiconductor manufacturing equipment systems with which you can make the most powerful chips, because that was already under controls from 2018 or 2019, but also impose controls on trailing edge systems, so immersion DUV systems for Japanese companies and for ASML in the Netherlands, of course. And this is where China put gallium and germanium on the list. So if we look at this action-reaction cycle, this is really mostly US-China driven. And the question that we were stuck with, and many policymakers who don't fully focus on China and industry leaders who don't fully focus on China were stuck with this year, is why did Beijing so dramatically cut back supply of rare earths, gallium, germanium, graphite, antimony, and all of the things that we need to maintain both our industries and our critical state functions to us? I think a lot can be deduced if we actually look at the tools that China used. So not just the reduction, but in which way did China use this? And what I can think you'll find, and this is if you go to the next slide, if you look at President Xi's statements, you see something very consistent over the last decade plus, namely that manufacturing is the real economy. Manufacturing is the backbone of everything that China needs to accomplish. In Made in China 2025, presented in 2015, the introduction opens with, without a large, and later on in the text it says advanced, manufacturing industry, there can't be a country or a nation. And how do the Chinese know this? They know this from the rise and fall of great power since the Industrial Revolution, including the history of China, is what the text says. Well, Xi Jinping goes further than that. Xi Jinping in 2020 says, in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we must tighten international production chains dependent on China. Why? Because this is a powerful deterrent and a countermeasure against countries that would otherwise cut off supply to China. So in the first statement, you see a clear intention of moving towards a self-reliant industrial fortress. In the second statement, you see the explicit intention to keep other countries dependent. And of course, we've seen this in very concrete measures, banning either officially or informally the exports of the critical machines we need to produce the rare earths. Or in the 9 October controls, now postponed for 12 months, there was a clause as well saying that Chinese nationals can't work on rare earth projects abroad anymore that might create capabilities outside of China. Well, it goes beyond that. If you look at the current preparations for the 15th five-year plan, what's very central is China needs to overcome technological bottlenecks. And I think how Japanese companies and European companies should read that is the Chinese state saying, we are here to replace you. In the end, we want what you are doing to be done by a Chinese company. This is accelerated by a sense of being under threat. In 2022, Xi Jinping warns of attempts to contain, blackmail, and coerce China that may escalate at any time. And he insists we must build a situation in which even under extreme circumstances, the normal operation of the economy can be maintained. And if you then look at separate interviews with individual Chinese academics, I mean, the question is, what is an extreme situation? And then they say it has to do with the South China Sea issue, with the Taiwan issue, the idea of tensions with the US and its allies are coming to a climax. It's increasingly important to build this fortress economy. And there's one concept that appears, and that's the concept of Shashujian, the assassin's mace. And the assassin's mace is from Chinese allegory. It's a magical weapon that one can use to overcome a more powerful rival at a crucial point in strategic competition. And if we then connect that back to how China has actually used export controls over the last year, and with the enormous success, which I really think is understated, of what it has achieved by using this critical raw material weapon, I think we can safely say that China found its assassin's maze. And it's export controls on critical raw materials, but not just on critical raw materials. I mean, in 9 October controls battery technologies, and the batteries themselves are also involved, but they're now suspended by 12 months. So there's a hint there, right? It shows we can onshore all of the critical raw materials we like. If all the batteries are produced in China, you still face the same issue. Same for the rare earth. We can onshore all the rare earths we like. If all the permanent magnets are made in China, you still have the same issue. Well, luckily, Japan produces permanent magnets as well, just not at scale. So if we go through sort of the 8 weapons that we found as EUISS that are packed into this one critical raw material weapon, we think it's first of all, it's a tool for military and commercial intelligence gathering. And this has to do with the license procedure. 11% of European companies surveyed on this issue complain that they have to give so much excessive information during the license procedure to get an export license for these critical raw materials that it is at risk of violating their IP, transferring their IP to Chinese companies or the Chinese state and then via the Chinese state to Chinese companies. Well, in the commercial realm, that's bad. In the military realm, it's worse. We've had anecdotal evidence of the Chinese demanding pictures of drone motors, pictures of production sites, wanting to know the amount of gallium you want to then make a calculation how much gallium is in the product you produce. So a very careful way to deduce the product recipes of specific European key goods. But not just that, there's more use of the spyglass. China wants to know who your customers are. And not just your customers, it wants to understand who your defense industrial customers are. So it's mapping our defense industrial chain via the critical raw material dominance. And I would argue there's already damages to our security just via the intelligence gathering. And that's even before there's a denial of critical raw material supplies that of course has been there as well. Because this doesn't happen in isolation. This happens at a time when we also see an uptick of Chinese attempts to intrude critical infrastructure throughout rival countries, which gives it the ability to commit sabotage at a later stage. Well, then it's very useful to know who the parties in the defense industrial base are. Not just that, but we also see this at a time of an uptick in Chinese economic espionage. So it complements all sorts of other Chinese efforts, including joint venture requirements to be on the Chinese market, etc., to extract technology transfer. So that's the first weapon that we see, I think the spyglass. A second weapon that also has to do more with coercion than actually degrading our industries is what we would call the crowbar. So you use the dependence on critical raw materials to try and get concessions in unrelated areas. In Brussels, we've experienced this by the Chinese showing up this summer and saying, well, it's very unfortunate you're short on rare earths and permanent magnets. We know your car companies depend on it. Why don't you just get rid of your import duties on EVs? And why don't you just get rid on the local content requirements for your medical systems? And perhaps we can do something about this. And of course, this worked brilliantly with the Trump administration, right? Everyone thought that the US was focused on its course on what Jake Sullivan called maintain as large a lead as possible, ever tightening tech controls on China. Well, China stuck the crowbar in. And as a result of that, car companies were short permanent magnets. Tech for Trump himself doesn't appear to be a priority, but reindustrialization is. So suddenly US tech policy endangered US reindustrialization policy. Car companies complained, without these permanent magnets, we cannot produce our cars here in the US. And if we don't have the permanent magnets, we may have to offshore engine production or the entire car production to China. So it's one of the great ironies where China changes the fortunes in this conquest over both tariffs and over tech controls. And of course, we now see the outright reversal of the US policy, very dangerously for both Japan and for Europe, because Trump is not just offering NVIDIA chips, not just the H20, also the H200, but also related technologies for other American companies. So there's tech control relief for American companies, and we don't see similar relief for European and Japanese companies. Well, I'm personally quite convinced that we shouldn't export these highly valuable and highly sensitive goods to China anyway. But if we're going to break down these tech restrictions, it is very unequal to just break down the US tech restrictions. So it's really a major achievement on the Chinese part, really reversing a policy that was in place for almost 8 years, 9 years, of maintaining as large a lead as possible, ever-growing controls. But then, of course, and this is the next slide, there's not just that, there's not just coercion, there's also corrosion of rivals' capabilities. And one is what we call the sledgehammer. You take out building blocks of the production of another party. Well, from the newest EU Chamber of Commerce in China survey, we know that not just 11% complains about IP transfer via these tech controls. No, 40% complains that delivery takes an additional 2 months because of Chinese export controls. Not just that, I just looked it up before coming here. 38% says that they expect significant supply disruptions or even production stoppages or slowdowns once China implements all of its controls, so also the 9 October ones. And then maybe finally from the survey, there was one company that experienced additional costs up to 20% of its global revenue, not Chinese revenue, global revenue, because it couldn't get the essential inputs anymore from China. Already in the summer, in August, 7 European companies said they experienced production disruptions, possibly even stoppages, and another 40 plus expected to face that in September. And what I should emphasize with all of this data is companies don't like to talk about their problems. So these are just the first signals we see of the state of the problem weeks ago, or even months ago. There's a good reason to assume that the problem is likely worse. Because of, I mean, if you're a company, first of all, sometimes you have a stock price. Sometimes if you're a defense company, you're competing for new contracts in the EU to be part of rearmament. This is a very bad time to admit you have major production issues. And of course, for the defense sector, we don't want to admit that because we both here in East Asia and in Eastern Europe, we have deterrence to sustain. This information then also ends up in Beijing and in Moscow, where you don't want it to end up. Well, with that pulling out of key building blocks comes a second effect, and that is what we call the fish trap effect, where you basically see that because companies can't get specific inputs outside of China anymore, they consider offshoring more production to China. And this is from the same EU survey. 11% of companies said, I will produce more in China using my existing capacity that I already have in China to deal with the export controls. And 4% said, I might even build up new production capacity in China. So the whole irony is that because China weaponizes dependencies, we are at risk of becoming even more dependent. Because we can't get critical building blocks anymore outside of China because of the export controls. Well, there's a separate category that I think can't be emphasized enough, and that's the rug. It's not just an attack on commercial industries, but under Europe's rearmament, China is trying to pull the rug from underneath. And that's not just Europe's rearmament, it's the expansion of the defense industrial base in the United States. And it's doing that by categorically denying exports to defense end use of these materials and these other things that it has under control. Officially, in the 9 October controls, it said really military end use is prohibited. Then the 9 October controls were delayed by 12 months, but what we hear from companies, no, defense end use is still not possible. And we see problems with germanium for night vision goggles. We see problems with permanent magnets for basically anything, for fighter jets, for drones. We see problems with gallium as a result of this. And the timeline is short. Rearmament in Europe needs to happen now. Expansion of the defense industrial base in East Asia and in the US needs to happen now, because the Russians and the Chinese are also very rapidly expanding their defense capabilities. So China pulling the rug from underneath these sectors is coming at the worst possible moment. There's of course an interest in that, because if you look at the statements of China's foreign ministers in Brussels, he, in conversations with the EU delegation, said it's not in our interest if Russia loses the war in Ukraine. Why? Because then the US can focus all of its means on East Asia. And at the same time, of course, we know that the US is billions of dollars behind in weapons supplies to basically everyone, but also to Taiwan specifically, which is another reason why an expansion of the defense industrial base in the US or in East Asia or in Europe is not in China's interest. Well, then in the next slide, we have two more. 6, it's an innovation decelerator, because technology, as it progresses, depends on a larger and larger mix of specific materials. If you look at radar systems without gallium, I've been told by industry experts, if you don't use gallium in your chips for the radar systems, your radar systems fall back several decades, possibly even to the levels of the 1980s. If we don't use heavy rare earths in the magnets that we use for our fighter jets, the magnets might melt, because we need the heavy rare earths to sustain the enormous temperatures that are there. But also commercially we need it. For photonics you need indium. Indium is one of the controlled materials by China. Not just that, quantum requires gallium. So everyone globally works with a box full of building blocks to build new technologies. If we only have some of the blocks and China has all of them, it can outcompete us also technologically. And this is very dangerous, because if we look at the competition that's ongoing in East Asia and we look at the competition that's ongoing in Europe, China and Russia have the manpower and the production capacity advantages. And that's why it's so important that it doesn't close the military technological edge, the military technological gap, and get a military technological edge, because that is still what we base our deterrence on. We can't mobilize the same kind of manufacturing. Why? Because China manufactures over 30% of all goods worldwide already. And according to one UN projection, this will go up to 45% in 2030 if Japan, the EU, and other countries don't change course. Which is why it's so important to emphasize that if we don't make a radical change, the costs of doing nothing are enormous. 7, it's also a transatlantic wedge, and I wouldn't just say a transatlantic wedge, but a wedge between allies. Why? The scarcity that China creates causes new problems for us. 2 examples in the lead up to a very contentious NATO summit in June. There are reports of President Trump personally calling fellow heads of government to ask, do you have any magnets for me? Adding another problem to the long list of problems that there already were between the Americans and the Europeans on NATO, and at a very difficult time in which we desperately try to keep the US in the alliance. But it's not just that, of course. We see much more serious diversification efforts in Japan and the US. But this might cause problems as well, right? China cuts off gallium supply. The midstream Japanese and European companies are competitors of each other. Japan brings online gallium supply. And in the beginning, when there's still a shortage, Japan will understandably prioritize its own companies because this has been achieved with public money. While I understand, it is a problem for our level playing field among allies. And this is, of course, it risks ending up, if we don't act well, also with the US that's going very fast on this, this risks ending up in trade conflicts between partners and allies instead of a joint forceful response to China. And then finally, the last weapon is a deterrent and a shield for China. the situation around Taiwan is difficult enough. I don't have to emphasize that here in Japan, given your experience over the last couple of months. But as China increases its pressure, it now knows that it can't just rely on a balance of forces in the region that's increasingly in its favor because of the rapid expansion of the People's Liberation Army. No, it knows that it can also rely on a balance of dependencies that's increasingly in its favor. That whenever it puts a new move on Taiwan or it intensifies the military exercises, whoever protests can again be hit by critical raw material controls or whatever. And the same is, of course, true for our attempts to protect our economies better against Chinese overproduction and overconcentration of supply. Whenever we put in place new measures, China can say, well, this month, fewer rare earths for you. So it's really a deterrent, a shield in that way. Well, I took a bit long on the problem statement, so I think we need to move towards the actual solutions. And then I invite you to look at the grid that's on the bottom of slide 6. And it is this table. And that's the outcome of an exercise I did with a dear colleague from another think tank, John Seaman from IFRI. And we basically asked European industry think tanks and policymakers if we have to be China-free by 2030 for gallium, germanium, and rare earths. If we want to achieve that, what do we have to do immediately to get there? And everyone agreed that the most effective policies, so the ones highest up on the system, were financial support. You're not going to get there without financial support. Well, Europeans now have a lot of room for financial support. We have a NATO budget. 3.5% of defense spending can be used for dual-use research, provided that the military component can be accounted for. Well, I would say learning how to make the machines to produce rare earths has a very clear military implication. And it should be eligible under this defense spending. And if you look at the 1.5% that comes on top of that 3.5%, that 1.5% says it can be used to strengthen the defense industrial base. Well, why not the defense industrial sub-base? Why not all the materials and the semiconductors that go into that base? Because what we see at present is earlier this year or late last year, no, I think earlier this year, the Dutch Minister of Defense said on television, I don't even know how to spend 2% on defense because the weapon systems are not available. Well, if the weapon systems are not available and on top of that the critical raw materials are not available and you're going to try and spend 5%, we're just going to have massive inflation of these costs and we're not going to have more weapon systems. So if we don't use the defense money to actually bring online the critical raw material supply, we'll be in big trouble. The second question, of course, is financial support. Yes, but where? Does it all have to be in Europe? And this is where we have made the argument, no, it does not have to be in Europe. JOGMEC has much more advanced projects. Part of it should be in Europe, but we should try to be co-investors and off-takers on JOGMEC projects. Because you're speeding ahead in gallium. In terms of the rare earth pipeline, it looks good, but it still needs to scale. These are all things that we can help out with. And that is our consistent message in Brussels. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. We have a hierarchy of threats. China cutting us off from critical raw materials is one. Well, the EU-US relations are complicated as well. Whereas I say being dependent on both the US and China and Japan is of course a lot better than just being dependent on China. There are still those in Europe who might say, I don't like this dependence on the US. And then I say, fine, for the longer term, we should still build our own JOGMEC and we should also invest on capabilities in Europe. But we have an immediate problem, and that immediate problem is the defense industrial base and our commercial sectors. So co-invest and do offtake with the Japanese, which I understand during my trip here, which was very helpful, that there's willingness on the Japanese side as well to engage in that collectively. But as I was told, no free riding, which is a message I'll take home to my European fellow Europeans. So that's that. But a really key part of this workshop that we had focused on something else. And it wasn't just a question, how do you bring online supply for key building blocks? Now, how do you sustain it? How do we make sure that if China tries to flood markets, let's say in half a year or 1 year, that we are protected, that whatever we're trying to build around the world doesn't succumb to Chinese below market price products. And here we need to work on the demand side. And this is where I think there's a huge opportunity in 2026 on the European side. We're going to reform public procurement. Well, one figure that I've seen recently is that 23% of all permanent magnets globally go into wind turbines. Wind turbines, in the end, are all publicly procured. And the EU is still pushing very hard to actually do the energy transition. A lot of demand will emanate from us. If you talk right now to the people who actually do these tenders and you ask what are the conditions, they say it needs to be as cheap as possible and the fish in the sea, etc., need to survive. Well, if those are your two conditions, you're going to buy the cheapest permanent magnets from China. So your policies are aggravating the issue. Your policies are making dependence deeper on China. If we have buy European plus partner requirements, and that can be broad, it doesn't just need to be the G7, it can also be individual countries like Congo, for cobalt, for instance. If we create that demand and we steer that demand cleverly, we can take back steps. And over time, once we have our own supply, we can always do this with tariffs as well, or even with obligations within private industries to source from European and partner countries. But the key conclusion from the workshop was promote needs to happen before protect. We first need to bring online supply outside of China, because without that, you can say it should be buy European plus partner, but then it's going to be buy nothing at all, because the materials are not available yet. I see really an opportunity with the US here as well. The US is very actively engaging on critical raw materials. The US put in place these tariffs that are incredibly unhelpful, both for its own reindustrialization and the reindustrialization of allies. We should push for a 0 for 0 tariff, sectoral tariff, with the US on critical raw materials. And after that, we can take the same lessons to semiconductors and the other horizontal things that we all rely on. And why? The logic is that even North America is too small to build a fortress North America in both semiconductors and critical raw materials. Critical raw materials for geological reasons, semiconductors for highly task specialized reasons. You need a bigger group. Without that scale, you're not going to be able to take supply bottlenecks out of China. Yeah, and then maybe an additional point on this. The US has been very successful in getting its private companies involved. I'm told that Japan is also very successful in this. This is something that we really have to work on in Europe as well. End users need to understand they make a lot of the margins, and we want them to take responsibility throughout this thing and to help bring this online. And in the US, of course, you see that we have Apple's commitment to spend $400 million on the MP materials mine, etc., which, I mean, is also a result of Trump using the bully pulpit, right? Trump saying, well, Apple, why do you produce all your phones in China? You might have, we don't like that. And then also Apple needs to move in his direction. Well, what does Trump really care about? Rare earths. Already before the election, on the Joe Rogan podcast, he was talking about raw earths. So it's something that stuck with him. So companies know that this is important. Well, that is how we would build what I would call allied autonomy. It can't be Japanese autonomy, it can't be European autonomy, it can't be US, North America autonomy. We build allied autonomy, but we should also make use of our respective indispensability. Because if I look at where Chinese export controls are going, especially 9 October ones, batteries is on there. Not just batteries, all the machines needed to produce the batteries. Suspended for 12 months, yes, but it shows this is not a critical raw material specific problem. It is a horizontal layers of the global economy problem that China can weaponize. And if it's not the batteries, it can be the assembly, test, and packaging, as we've seen with Nexperia. If it's not the assembly, test, and packaging, it can be the front-end production, as we're going to increasingly see with legacy chips. This is what happens if we allow one country with very assertive policies and increasingly very conflicting intentions of ours, if you allow that one country to amass so much manufacturing. So we also need to be able to establish economic deterrence. Well, there is still things we have. There is lithography equipment that China can't build itself, including an entire reliance on the Chinese side on servicing and spare parts. There is photoresist that Japan excels in. There's memory chips that Japan and Korea excel in. There's software that the US excels in. There is airplane parts that Airbus and Boeing excel in. So we have pressure points, but there is a failure here because European industry, especially the semiconductor industry, and the former CEO of ASML again made this point in the newspaper. Their logic is we are mutually dependent, so we won't be coerced. Whereas what we've seen this year is we are mutually dependent and we were coerced. The difference is that China can make a credible threat on the basis of what it controls, and so far the EU cannot. I'm not sure how this is in Japan-China negotiations, but there is a very important point that we should establish what a fellow colleague, a colleague from a different think tank in Brussels calls a doctrine of mutually assured destruction in the economic realm. If we don't get our critical economic inputs, and mind you, we are also very dependent on medicine from China, there's a consequence for what we are going to supply you. And we need to find an equilibrium there. That's on the critical raw materials. I know I have 2 minutes left, right?
Right.
2 minutes for semiconductors. What I'll say about the semiconductors, I'll be very brief. All the same dilemmas that you find in critical raw materials, you find in semiconductors. Japan talks about both autonomy and indispensability. The European Chips Act talks about both resilience and security of supply, which to me sounds like autonomy, and about competitiveness and innovation, which to me sounds like indispensability. And then the European Chips Act had a 20% share of global production capacity in Europe because this would serve security of supply. And our question was always why? Because let's say, if you say this needs to be 20% of front-end production, well, what happens if you're still dependent on the back-end production on China and Taiwan and the region here? Is that security of supply? Or you're still dependent on the photoresist? Or you're still dependent on the critical raw materials from China? That's not autonomy. That's not a measure. Well, this came under a lot of criticism. We then had the Semiconductor Coalition Declaration, 27 EU member states that said, no, the end goal shouldn't be autonomy, it should be strategic indispensability. We make ourselves so important that others won't coerce us. It should be prosperity, and it should be resilience, that our critical sectors still get the chips they need, regardless of what happens globally. And then we said, well, that last part sounds a lot just like autonomy. I don't understand the difference between that and resilience. Well, we workshopped this with companies, and we did a scenario workshop with companies, policymakers, think tankers, and we said 2035, imagine 4 different futures, one in which we're entirely autonomous, one in which we are only indispensable but not autonomous at all, and we continue to be so dependent on China, and one in which Europe is indispensable but a coalition is autonomous, meaning we took the supply chain bottlenecks out of China. What future do you think is likely to be possible, and which one do you think is most desirable? And that future, European indispensability, allied autonomy, was overwhelmingly the preference of the parties involved. Well, then the second question is, what policies need to be put in place to achieve that? Well, European indispensability, there's a lot of domestic policies. We need lower energy prices. We need more STEM talent. We want to aggressively attract STEM talent to Europe from everywhere around the world. Well, except for maybe high-risk countries where you have the risk of technology transfer. We want to make sure that we have more funding for our startups to become scale-ups and then big companies and then unicorns. We want to simplify regulation so that it's a lot more easier to actually produce stuff in Europe. We want to train many more engineers in Europe itself. That's the indispensability part. And then bottom up, you create the conditions and the network and the investment for companies to flourish, for ASML to expand its production, for companies like Smart Photonics to become the very promising future photonics AI accelerators that they can be. and that we have indispensable new positions across the world, so that these indispensable parts can flourish. Well, that's clear, but how do you build allied autonomy? If you go back to it, it's the same measures that apply to the critical raw materials. You need joint economic security standards with the G7 plus partners. In your public procurement, you need to make sure that it also has a preference for buy European plus partner. In your tariff policy later on, you need to make sure you align that as well. And for semiconductors, of course, there's also hard security issues. So for defense, we need to make sure that we don't have national security threats via semiconductors in essential defense systems because we got them from China. It doesn't entirely work the same. I think public procurement makes a lot more sense for critical raw materials, and the reason is that a lot of the public procured sectors like energy transition and defense, they are intense for critical raw materials but less intense for semiconductors. So you need to arrange the policies differently. But you can use this as a skill. And then we can use this, of course, to go to the Americans as well, saying Fortress North America is not going to work out, or likely not going to work out. Why can't we have a 0-for-0 tariff regime for semiconductors too? Right now, chemical production, which is as essential, is leaving Europe for both the US, but also for China. China is expanding its capacity. We might have these problems with China too. So the lessons that we're going to learn, and the lessons that I think we should first learn with critical raw materials, we can then, once it works there, apply more broadly throughout all these horizontal sectors on which we all depend. I'll leave it right there, and then we can go to the discussion.